So Dr. Elizabeth Thiele is a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and is the director of the Pediatric Epilepsy Program and the Center for Dietary Therapy of Epilepsy and the Hirschkott Center for TSC, and the director of the Dravet Syndrome Clinical Program at Massachusetts General Hospital. I have no idea how you have time to do all of those interesting things. Dr. Thiele directs clinical research efforts in the neurological aspects of tuberous sclerosis complex, or TSC, including epilepsy, autism, and mental health issues. She's the principal investigator on many clinical trials, and then she's going to tell us all about those today, and has received numerous awards for her teaching and research program. She received both her MD and PhD from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and did a residency in pediatrics and a residency in child neurology as well. And she completed a neuroscience fellowship at Children's Hospital in Boston. She is board certified in neurology with special qualification in child neurology and epilepsy. And I have been following your work for a long time, and it really is a thrill to welcome you to share the role of cannabinoids in the treatment of epilepsy, more than a millennia in the making.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks for the ABU stuff, because I definitely don't have the skills for that. So I'd like to thank Lauren for the opportunity to be here. And I also, it's a real treat and honor for me to have Ethan Russo in the room. I'm a pediatric epileptologist, and I kind of think what I always tell our residents and students is whenever we practice medicine, we do so by kind of class 1 data and experience, but I think it's also important to learn from anecdotes. And when you see an anecdote, take a step back. And that's what got me into this whole thing of CBD for epilepsy about 10 years ago. I knew nothing about cannabis, had never and have not ever smoked it or used it. But thanks to Ethan's help and kind of this journey, I kind of now am completely obsessed with it. So what I'm going to talk today about is the development of CBD is to treatment in epilepsy, not naming basically Epidiolex and the Epidiolex journey. Okay, these are my disclosures. And then kind of just to set the stage, because I realize that even though everyone in the room is pediatric focused, not all epilepsy focused. Epilepsy is a significant social medical issue. The incidence of epilepsy, this is Institute of Medicine report in 2012, but the numbers are thought to be fairly similar. The incidence of epilepsy in the United States per year is 150,000 new cases, and the prevalence of epilepsy in the United States is about 2.2 million people. And the prevalence of epilepsy worldwide is thought to be greater than 65 million people. The estimate of refractory epilepsy, and that's seizures that do not respond to 2 or more appropriate medications, is about 730,000 people living in the United States, and worldwide 21.7 million people. And as you know, kind of if you look at the prevalence and incidence of epilepsy, very high in pediatrics, and kind of goes down after adolescence, then again in the older ages. So much of these numbers reflect a pediatric population. So in 2023, there continues to be a significant unmet need for patients with refractory epilepsy, including focal epilepsies, genetic epilepsies, Dravet syndrome, which there's been a lot of buzz about because that's where these trials have occurred, tuberous sclerosis complex, which has been a big focus of my career, Angelman syndrome. There's now over 300 or 400 genes that have been identified as be associated with epilepsy. And then also we have our catastrophic epilepsies, where not only do the individuals have seizures, but they have significant comorbidities, including often severe intellectual disability, as well as other issues. So a lot of unmet need. And kind of what we know is that about 1/3 of patients who develop epilepsy will develop refractory epilepsy. And this is unfortunately not changed, even with all of our new medicines. Kwan and Brody back in 2001 did a very, very highly cited and famous study, taking 470 new onset patients with epilepsy in Scotland and the UK, and showed that of those patients with new onset epilepsy, about 50% respond to the first medication. So that's good news. A smaller piece of the pie respond to the second medication, and then about 1/3 of the pie doesn't respond and is refractory. In the past 20 years, we've had about 20 new anti-seizure medications come out. So there's been a lot of action in the pharmaceutical industry for seizure medications, but they repeated that study in 2017. And even with these new medications, those pie charts were almost superimposable. So there's been a lot of talk with these new medicines. Why is it not changed? Thought maybe need different models. There's different animal models that drugs are kind of processed through, seeing could this be effective in epilepsy? Or do we need new medications with different mechanisms of action? A lot of our current medications modulate excitability of neurons by modifying sodium channels, et cetera. Do we need something new? But it's also important to know that in addition to the pharmaceutical products for epilepsy, we do have alternative therapies, including, as Lauren said, I'm a zealot for dietary therapy of epilepsy, and that's been another big focus of my career. We also have neuromodulation and then a very important role of epilepsy surgery. But unfortunately, these alternative therapies are not appropriate for every patient. So a significant unmet need. So then kind of turning to making a case for cannabidiol. And when I first kind of heard about this, learned about this, it was actually extremely sobering and humbling for me that this was not a new idea by any stretch of the imagination. So what can history teach us? Then looking at the possible mechanisms of action, do they make sense? What did we learn from preclinical animal models of CBD and what did they suggest? What is the clinical data? And then what do we need to know? So and Ethan taught me this, and I didn't know that cannabis actually as medical treatment has been used for thousands of years. And probably the first reference was in 2200 BCE in some stone text from Sumeria, and then also very early reports from the Middle East. Then I was also very surprised to learn that there was a pretty healthy medical literature in the 1800s of the use of cannabis in various disorders, including 1842, a report from Shaughnessy that reported cannabis reduced infantile convulsions, as well as other disorders. So for me, not only being an epileptologist, but being a pediatric epileptologist, this raised interest in infantile convulsions. And then in 1856, McMeans reported the successful use of a tincture of cannabis indica in 4 children with epilepsy, including a 7-week female. So again, pediatric population, possible therapy, including in neonates. And as you know, in the 1800s, we really didn't have any anti-seizure medications, and particularly we're still limited in 2023 in medications that are safe, effective, and well tolerated in children, especially in neonates. Evidence was gathering so much that in 1851 in the US dispensary, cannabis compounds were actually recommended for several disorders, including convulsive disorders. And in 1860, the Ohio Medical Society Committee on Cannabis Indica claimed efficacy for infantile convulsions, epilepsy, and many other disorders. And then in how did I miss that? Hang on just a second. Yeah, and then 1881, so for neurologists, it's a geeky thing for neurologists, but you in pediatrics might remember the Gowers maneuver that's looked for muscular dystrophy of having kids kind of crawl up in their legs. So William Gowers, very famous child neurologist, also reported on cannabis in the treatment of epilepsy, saying that Russell Reynolds in 1861 had used this sometimes, though not very frequently useful, small values in adjunct to the bromide, which was the only medication, and phenobarbital came out in 1911. So by then, bromides were dead. But is sometimes of considerable service given separately. And Gowers actually himself administered cannabis in many cases, with the effect of delaying paroxysms and mitigating the severity in some individuals. So not only were lots of reports and a growing medical literature on this, but by very legit and very respected neurologists. And then things changed in 1911. As I said yesterday, I always say, you know, I'm very proud to live in Massachusetts. We're a very blue state. So it was very disappointing to me that it was my blue state that was the first state to outlaw cannabis in 1911. And that was in the setting of prohibition of alcohol. And the other states quickly followed with marijuana prohibition laws. And then also things got even worse in the US and worldwide in 1970 when the US Controlled Substance Act passed, classifying marijuana as a drug with no accepted medical use. And as you know, this made further characterizing and appreciating possible clinical utility as well as the pathophysiology, physiology, and science of the chemicals in this plant almost impossible. Things then started changing again in 1996 when California became the first state in the United States to legalize marijuana. And then by 2015, medical marijuana was legalized in 23 US states. As you know, the DEA is state regulated in the United States, so it has to be done at a state level. And CBD was specifically made legal in an additional 16 states. And that's actually one of my favorite aspects of this story is this was not big pharma coming in and saying, we're going to develop this medication for seizures. This was really driven by the patient community. There was a paucity of effective treatments, a lot of kids having nasty seizures and the comorbidities, and families really wanted access to this as a possible medical therapy. And that really led to this massive kind of move of legalizing this in that many states in that shorter period of time. And then there are increasing anecdotal reports about the efficacy of medical marijuana, especially CBD-enriched formulations in the treatment of refractory pediatric epilepsy. So what about medical marijuana? And this audience knows this, but actually when this kind of started in the United States almost 10 years ago, the medical community knew nothing about this. I'm impressed that Canadian medical schools talk about cannabis at all. I don't think any of them do in the United States. I don't think many medical schools even talk about the endocannabinoid system. But as you know, cannabinoids, a family of greater than 120 chemical compounds unique to cannabis, the phytocannabinoids, and CBD and THC are the most abundant and best characterized. And then that's the interest in, well, what is the relationship of the phytocannabinoids to the endocannabinoids? So, and kind of this, I showed this yesterday, but one of our residents, because they know that I'm kind of obsessed with cannabis. So one of our residents found this on Etsy, and this shows all of the chemical compounds in the cannabis plant. And my husband one day with the magnifying glass was able to identify CBD and THC. But I think just showing the possible wealth of this plant, even though they're two most abundant cannabinoids, I think we have a lot to learn about what the other possible therapeutic benefits of these other chemicals in cannabis are. Then medical marijuana, and this is a situation in the United States where other aspects and other formulations are not regulated. So in the United States, there are extracts of cannabis or hemp, again, state regulation. So if I wanted access to something from Colorado, if they wanted to ship it to me, it'd be hemp-based, not cannabis-based. They can be enriched in CBD, THC, but contain all the compounds of the plant, so they're extracts. And the major ones over the past 10 years in the US are Charlotte's Web from the Stanley Brothers in Colorado, probably the both best known, but others like Haley's Hope, Palmetto Harmony, etc. And then kind of what we're going to talk about today, different from that, is cannabidiol, which is the biologic derivative purified from cannabis, 99% pure. It's formulated in 100 milligram per milliliter sesame seed oil. And important to me being a pediatrician, it is manufactured according to FDA GMP. And then in addition to this, in the United States, there's also been a synthetic CBD as well as transdermal CBD that have gone into clinical trials. So then cannabidiol, is there evidence that it could work through the endocannabinoid system to treat seizures? There's some evidence lower levels of anandamide, one of the endocannabinoids, was found in the spinal fluid of patients with newly diagnosed temporal lobe epilepsy. And in addition, tissue resected from epilepsy surgery a patient with epilepsy surgery was found to have lower levels of the CB1R receptor mRNA, as well as reduced expression of the enzyme responsible for the synthesis of 2-AG. But I think there's pretty compelling and accepted evidence now that cannabidiol does not exert its main neural effects through the activation of the CB1 receptor. So how could it work then? There's a lot of possible hypotheses, and kind of was mentioned yesterday, THC kind of cleaner. We know what it binds to CB1 receptors, but CBD may work through possible mechanisms. I think in the epilepsy world, the high players now are the GPR55 antagonists, decreasing the presynaptic release of glutamate by binding the TRPV1, activating serotonin receptors, another one of our medications that was recently approved as a serotonin modulator, adenosine, etc. So possible mechanisms. In the world of epilepsy, this is not a bad thing that we don't know exactly why a medication works. It used to be thought that, gee, if you have the most specific mechanism of action, you have a clean drug, an effective drug, well-tolerated drug. And I think what we realize now is some of our most effective, successful drugs are what were referred to as dirty drugs, drugs that can work through a variety of different mechanisms, but probably maybe cumulative together achieve the efficacy. So what did the animal models show CBD as a possible treatment in seizures? It was shown to be effective in several acute seizure models. And when drugs are being developed, there's an NIH program that will take a drug. If I wanted to kind of develop this for epilepsy, we'll an NIH screening program that will put any compound through these models. So it was shown to be effective. There's less convincing data in chronic seizure models, but this profile is actually very similar to the profile of levetiracetam, which for the past 20 years has been probably the #1 medication for seizures worldwide. And then CBD was also shown to increase the after discharge threshold and reduce after discharge amplitude, duration, and propagation in electrically kindled limbic seizures in rats. So pretty good evidence that this may be effective in treating seizures. But up until the trial started, really all the efficacy data was really anecdotal or open label. And I think the conversation I've had at least 1,000 times in the past 10 years with patients and families is CBD is not medical marijuana. And there's significant variability in the United States without this being kind of regulated in any way. The artisanal medical marijuana preparations, the DEA has gone around a couple times, so FDA has gone around a couple times over the past over 10 years, gotten high CBD containing products from various dispensaries, tested in them, and some of them contain no CBD. So with the lack of regulation, it's really difficult to know what we're using when we're treating anybody or people are taking these. And then also being a pediatrician, I have kind of concerns about what about those other greater than 500 chemicals in cannabis. I think that I am a believer in the FDA process of evaluating not only efficacy, but safety and tolerability. And I kind of think so there was a real need for a reproducible vetted CBD. And so that's kind of where I entered into this. And it all started really with an anecdote. I kind of was very sobering to me. One of my families from Maine has a daughter with schizencephaly, so very malformed brain, wicked bad epilepsy, had been on all the appropriate medications, a lot of nasty seizures. They heard about Charlotte's Web. They heard they could only get it in Colorado. Family had never been on an airplane before. And this family of 4 up and moved to Colorado. Dad worked for the Maine Transportation Department, left his job, moved to Colorado just to get access to their daughter for that. And then the second anecdote was a patient I take care of from California had come to us years before for diet. He had a type of epilepsy called myoclonic astatic epilepsy or Deuce syndrome, which is also highly refractory, been on all the appropriate medications, had been on diet. Diet worked, but a 7-year-old had tolerated difficulty tolerating restrictiveness. So medical marijuana became available. His parents, whom I'm quite close to, called and said, well, Elizabeth, what do you think we should do? And I said, I would try it. And he's been on all the other meds. I would try it. So they tried it, and they had the experience that many people in the United States have. Is sometimes they would get their batch, there would be a decrease in seizures, sometimes an increase in seizures. So the consistency of the product was really difficult. They even at one point tried extracting their own, thinking they could have a more consistent product. And one of the things I've been really impressed by and obsessed with about cannabis is how fickle the plant is and how the composition can change so dramatically depending on the environmental conditions it's growing in. They are a pretty sophisticated family, and they kind of read about this small company in the UK, GW Pharma, who was doing cannabinoid science for 20 years, and that had some preclinical evidence that cannabidiol may be effective. They contacted GW to say, could their son have access to that? And series of events. Helen Cross in the UK is a very close friend of mine, and Helen agreed to be involved in this. So Sam, who is patient number 1, went to London the week of Christmas week 2012. A 24-hour EEG Ellen did. He had, I think, 127 seizures. We did cannabidiol, 24-hour EEG, 4 seizures. So demonstrating efficacy. He came back to California. Another of my friends, Roberta Cilia, who's at UCSF, now in Belgium, got an IND and was enabled Sam to be on it. In order for UCSF to have CBD on site, the DEA required that they have a 2,000-pound safe that could be bolted to the ground to contain this Schedule I medication in the United States. So in April of 2013, 5 academic centers, including us, UCSF, NYU, and met with the folks at GW, some of the folks in the regulatory system in the United States. And I'll never forget this meeting. It was in a very small conference room in New York, no windows. And we all talked about how we felt that we had a responsibility to figure out for our patients if this was not only effective, but a safe and well-tolerated medication for their seizures. And that started the expanded access program. And I think that this is really another part of this development is what each of those sites had to do to demonstrate why we felt those patients should have access to a Schedule I medication that had no safety PK data in children. Was we all had to write a biography of each of the 25 kids we wanted to start on this medication for the FDA and the DEA, describing the patient, what their epilepsy was due to, kind of their treatment history. All of these kids had been on multiple medications. Many of the kids had had epilepsy surgery. Most of my kids had been on diet. Many had the vagus nerve stimulator. All of them continued to have very impactful epilepsy. So what biography is all of those, and then permission was granted for us to do this. So 5 initial sites, and then this program grew. There ended up being over 1,000 individuals in the program, not only through academic centers that joined the EAP, but also some state programs. We ended up enrolling 61 patients. The first 25 started Epidiolex in April 2014. So we now have patients who have been on this product for over 9 years. As the program grew, this is the open label data from the first 214 patients. And even though this was not a trial, this was compassionate use, we decided we wanted to kind of be able to combine our experiences and look at the data. We would run it kind of like a trial. And so all the patients had to have medically refractory epilepsy, and then we had a shared trial design. And so what we saw, again, we're mainly looking at safety and tolerability. What we saw is that there were adverse events in about 78 of the patients. And this is another thing I've been very impressed with this product is in the in the expanded access program and all the clinical trials, the tolerability profile has been very consistent. So somnolence, decreased appetite, diarrhea, fatigue, and then convulsions were the most common. Serious adverse events were in 20%, status epilepticus the most common, again, reflecting the patient population, not the medication, and then diarrhea and weight loss, and 3% discontinued treatment due to an adverse event. But what we saw looking at this, again, emphasizing this is open label data, and there was a lot of concern at that time since it was thought that CBD was going to be the cure for epilepsy. We were really concerned about possible placebo effect. But these parents, all these families took this extremely seriously because they knew that this could be a potentially treatment for their child, but also for other people. So we had families calling us saying, well, this looked a little bit different. Should I count this as a seizure? So extremely dedicated to helping us with this. And what we saw is close to a 40% median reduction of motor seizures over the 12-week treatment period, higher efficacy in the Dravet patients. And we'll talk a little bit about Dravet, but I thought this was pretty wicked impressive efficacy. And then kind of a responder rate, about 40% had a greater than 50% reduction in seizures. And then 32 patients in this population had atonic seizures. And as you know, this is one of the most impactful seizure types. These are my kids that wear helmets because they drop without any warning and can have significant injury. So the fact that this showed promise in that seizure type was also impressive, and very impressive that in this population, 5 became completely seizure-free. So kind of with that, beginning with the expanded access program, again, this was novel drug development for seizure medication in the United States. Nothing had ever started with an expanded access program kind of leading up to the clinical trials. There subsequently were 5 clinical trials, and we're going to look at all of those briefly today, 2 in Dravet syndrome, 2 in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and then 1 in tuberous sclerosis complex. And all of these have now been published, and all of these trials were positive. So looking at the trial design, this is the trial design for the Dravet and the LGS trials. For each disorder, one of the trials has 2 arms. One of the trials was 3 arms. So this shows the diagram for the 3-arm trial, which is a placebo, low dose 10 mg per kg of CBD, high dose of 20 milligrams per kilogram CBD. There was a baseline period during which families kept seizure diaries, then randomization, 2-week titration, 12-week maintenance period. And then at the end of treatment, all of the patients had the opportunity to enroll in the open label. And for all of these trials, really the majority of patients did. So first looking at Dravet syndrome. Dravet syndrome is a severe infantile onset, highly treatment resistant epilepsy. It's due to a mutation in the SCN1A sodium channel gene. Onset in the first year of life, babies are typically completely normal development, normal everything. About 6 months of age, they have a first seizure, and then kind of all hell breaks loose. Typically develop infants, and then the second year of life, they develop multiple types of seizures. Often characterized with prolonged episodes of status epilepticus. These kids can have seizures that last a couple of hours, triggered by fever typically, and the majority develop intellectual disability, often quite severe. Also, this population, which is very frightening for people living with this in the community, has a much higher incidence of sudden unexplained death and epilepsy than the general refractory epilepsy population for reasons we do not understand. So this is the publication from the first Dravet trial, 2-arm trial that was the trial I was involved with. This trial enrolled 120 patients with Dravet syndrome. This is a pediatric trial up to age of 18. As you can see, these had refractory epilepsy, and they, as we said, were randomized either placebo or the 20 milligram per kilogram per day. And the primary endpoint in this trial was the change in convulsive seizure frequency over the 14-week treatment period compared to 4-week baseline. So the FDA required not only the maintenance period after titration, but the treatment period is a 2-week titration plus the 12-week maintenance. And this trial met all of its endpoints, both primary and secondary. So as you can see, there was a statistically significant greater reduction in seizures in the treatment group compared to placebo. The responder rate, there was also statistically significant further reduction or percentage of responders in the CBD group compared to placebo. And then one of the other secondary endpoints now incorporated in every epilepsy trial is the caregiver global impression of change. And there is also statistically significant reported improvement in the CBD group compared to placebo. And then again, in this Dravet population where we don't usually expect to see seizure freedom, the fact that there was 5% of these kids seizure free during the treatment period was pretty wicked impressive. Adverse events were more common in the CBD group as expected, but note that 93% versus 75% in the placebo group. Most frequent is what we saw in the open label expansion: diarrhea, vomiting, pyrexia, fatigue, somnolence. And then this is when we first kind of saw this abnormal results on liver function tests that we'll talk a little bit more later. So then turning from Dravet to Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is a completely different epilepsy. This is a highly treatment-resistant epilepsy, peak onset between 3 and 5 years of age. And this has numerous etiologies. So this is not a genetic epilepsy. There's a gazillion different reasons that can lead a child to have Lennox-Gastaut. And these kids develop multiple seizure types required for the diagnosis: drop seizures, tonic seizures, atypical absence seizures, tonic-clonic seizures. And in addition to these types of seizures, really is required to have a particular pattern on EEG called slow spike and wave, or 1.5 to 2 hertz, 2 per second, slow spike and wave on EEG. And similarly to Dravet, the majority of kids who develop Lennox-Gastaut have some degree of intellectual disability, often severe. Many kids with LGS are never ambulatory, never verbal, never able to provide care for themselves. So again, a devastating epilepsy. This is the publication that came out from the Dravet trial. Again, that was a 2-arm trial, placebo and 20 mg per kg per day. And looking kind of at the inclusion criteria, the important thing to note here is this was not just pediatric. This also included adults. And I point that out because one of the 2 most frequently questions I get asked about CBD is, does it work in adults? It works in kids, does it work in adults? We have data that it works in adults. And then the primary endpoint here was the change from baseline in drop seizures over the 14-week treatment period. So seizures would make a kid fall. And then looking at the demographics here, I think what is important to also see that the groups were pretty well matched. This trial enrolled 171 patients. And what I note here and have a lot of respect for here is if you look at the number of prior AEDs, that these kids were on a lot of medications prior to enrolling this trial. Look at that, 18 to 28 medications some of these patients had been on. And then they also had a lot of seizures, kind of looking at the range there, 177 seizures during the kind of baseline period, but up to 350. So pretty high seizure burden in this patient population. But shown graphically here are the results. And this trial also met its primary endpoint, looking at drop seizures, both in the treatment period, again, including that titration. And in the maintenance period, there was a statistically greater reduction in seizures in those on CBD than placebo. And not surprisingly, the efficacy was a little bit better after the titration period, just during that maintenance period. Secondary endpoint was non-drop seizures. Those other seizure types that we described can be included in this syndrome, also statistically significant reduction there, comparing CBD to placebo. Then looking at the global impression of change, also with this trial, the caregivers of those receiving CBD were much more likely to report an improvement than those on placebo. Again, looking at the tolerability, same side effects: diarrhea, somnolence, pyrexia, decreased appetite, and vomiting. And this is kind of where we appreciated a little bit more the elevation in LFTs, and that was seen. The majority of, in this trial and clinical use, the majority of kids who have an increase in LFTs are in concomitant valproate. Many of those improve without changes. Sometimes they improve with decreasing, oftentimes, the valproate. But importantly, during all the clinical development of this medication and subsequent post-marketing, there have been no situations of liver of elevations meeting Hy's law for significant liver injury. And these trials led to the FDA approval on June 25th in 2018. Epidiolex is indicated for the treatment of seizures associated with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or Dravet syndrome in patients 2 years of age or older. Wicked exciting in the United States. It was the first FDA-approved drug containing a purified drug substance derived from marijuana. And very important for not only the Dravet syndrome community, but the community of rare disorders. It was the first FDA-approved medication specifically for Dravet syndrome. And again, this went from Schedule 1. It's another story of all went to get a Schedule 1 license in the United States to start all of this, but went from Schedule 1, no medical use, DEA rescheduled to Class 5, which had to be done prior to its clinical availability, and then it was subsequently descheduled. So then turning to tuberous sclerosis, RCT, and tuberous sclerosis, again, which has been a huge, probably the major focus of my career. TS is a multi-system genetic disorder affecting about 1 in 6,000 people due to a mutation in either the TSC1 or TSC2 gene. Epilepsy is very common. About 80% of folks with TS will develop epilepsy, 70% with onset the first year of life, so a huge pediatric issue. And 2/3 of folks with TS will develop refractory epilepsy. So twice as many folks in TS will develop refractory epilepsy as in the general epilepsy population. And we and others have done a lot of work showing that it is the epilepsy that is clearly a risk factor for the intellectual disability, which affects 50%, autism, which affects 40%. And then there's been, fortunately, a big focus in the past several years on the TSC-associated mental health disorders, or TAN. There's an acronym now, and that are associated with significant morbidity in the majority of individuals with TSC. So this is the TSC trial, the publication from it. And this trial basically enrolled 244 patients with TS ages 1 to 65 with treatment-resistant epilepsy. And they had had greater than 8 seizures during the 4-week baseline, and these were seizures associated with tuberous sclerosis. Tuberous sclerosis is a focal epilepsy by definition. So second question I get asked most often about CBD is, does it work for focal epilepsy? We see it works for generalized. So this trial shows this. And this was randomized 3-arm trial, 1:1:1. And the main difference here is the doses were higher. So remember, in the DS trial, LGS trial, it was 10 and 20 milligrams per kilogram per day. In the TS trial, it was 25 milligrams per kilogram per day, or 50 milligrams per kilogram per day. And importantly, about a quarter of the people enrolled in this trial were adults. This trial, the titration period to the higher doses was 4 weeks instead of 2, and then the same 12-week maintenance. And the primary endpoint here was a % change from baseline, the number of TSC-associated seizures. This shows the trial design, mainly just, again, kind of emphasizing those doses were higher and that the baseline period was longer. And this shows the results. So both arms, treatment arms at 25 mg per kg and 50, had a statistically significant greater reduction in seizures than placebo. But what's important to note here also, there was not a dose response. 50 milligrams per kilogram was not better than 25 milligrams per kilogram. The other thing we learned from this trial, and again, the safety profile is here, same side effects. There were more side effects, as you would expect, in the 50 mg per kg per day than 25. But this kind of gave us, in a way, what someone referred to as safe passage. Because in epilepsies, I think with many things, there are dose ranges of our medications, and some people respond and do well at low dose, but some people need the high dose. So showing that even though there were more adverse events, it wasn't really astronomically higher at the 50 milligrams per kilogram per day. So this trial led to the approval in July of 2020 of purified cannabidiol for the treatment of seizures associated with tuberous sclerosis complex in patients 1 year of age and older. So this, again, proved efficacy of CBD in focal seizures, and importantly also lowered the FDA approval of the medication down to 1 year of age and older. And then there's been other papers. This is I'll show you kind of the graph of publications on this, but this is some of the other papers that have come out, particularly looking at tuberous sclerosis, which is a focus of ours. And this is the open label extension from that trial. There's also publications on the open label extension for the Dravet and LGS trials showing maintained efficacy as well as tolerability. And then this was something we looked at because there's preclinical evidence that CBD may modulate mTOR. And it's the disruption in the mTOR pathway that is the pathophysiology of TS. And so we thought, well, gee, could CBD have the same clinical impact on TS patients as the mTOR inhibitors? So we looked at that and it does not. Unlike the mTOR inhibitors, it does not lead to a decreased size of the renal angiomyolipoma or other issues. So at a preclinical level, there might be some modulation of mTOR, but not at a clinically significant level in patients living with TS. So then kind of we want to go back and say, well, where are they now? I mean, along the way of this journey, there have been a lot of what I call haters. When this program started in the United States, there were a lot of people very, very, very opposed to it. Ethan probably remembers this. And I was telling someone yesterday, I was actually told by one of my colleagues that I was threatening my career by getting involved with this. And I'm like, why? It's either going to work or it's not going to work. Why would that threaten my career? And then kind of when the open label data came out, well, that's just open label data. And then when the class 1 data came out, then there was a lot of all of it does is really potentiate clobazam. And there's a lot of work now that shows that even though the two together can be synergistic, clearly CBD on its own has efficacy. And then the other haters were like, oh, it doesn't work. The efficacy wanes off very quickly. So we wanted to look at that. So we went back to the folks that had enrolled in our expanded access program. And at the time of the FDA approval in 2018, 20 of our 61 had left the EAP. And the most common reason was lack of efficacy. So the lesson I learned from this, which is I think a very important lesson, is this does not work for everyone. I mean, really in the United States, with people moving to Colorado, et cetera, there really was a thought that this was the cure. This was going to be it for epilepsy. So it's important to realize it's not. And then 3 also left to try a CBD THC combo. Could the entourage effect be more effective? And 3 left for vape patients, left to enroll into the fenfluramine clinical trials. So when we looked at the most recent visit, which was a median of 4.5 months, ranging up to 5 years of these kids, the majority continued to have a pretty significant reduction in seizures, including 21% with greater than 90% reduction in seizures. And just keep in mind that these kids were my most refractory of all my epilepsy patients. What we also found as a little surprise was the mean dose was 32.2 milligrams per kilogram per day. So clearly we had some that required and were benefiting from those higher doses. And most of these folks had not had a change in the number of concomitant medications, although more were on fewer or lower doses. And this is basically on me and also on the families. These kids, this is the best seizure control they had ever had in their lives. And none of us were really anxious to try and rock the boats. But since this data cut and analysis, we have been able to taper down, and we now have several patients on CBD monotherapy. Then kind of, I always like to think, well, gee, how much of interest in the medical community is something. I do this for dietary therapy, did this last week for, if you go into PubMed, which started in 1965, and you say, cannabinoids and epilepsy, look at the number of publications, years on the x-axis, number of publications on the y-axis. You can see they're kind of in 2014 when the EAP program started, you start seeing an increase, and then kind of 2018, over 180 articles in the medical literature on cannabinoids in epilepsy. So when should CBD be used for the treatment of medically refractory epilepsy? I think that inarguably, CBD has been shown to be effective, safe and well tolerated in Dravet, Lennox-Gastaut, and TSC. The expanded access program and also the post-approval marketing program data which suggest a broad range of efficacy in different epilepsies. The drug-drug interactions are important, fairly well characterized, improving safety and tolerability. And there's a lot of talk about this. Especially pediatric epileptologists, where we get to be professionals at managing drug-drug interactions because we have so many medications and they have so many drug-drug interactions. Key one is the CBD and clobazam can lead to increase in levels of desmethylclobazam, which can lead to sedation and agitation. Interestingly, desmethylclobazam also has some anti-seizure activity, as does the main metabolite of CBD, which clobazam inhibits the metabolism, 7-hydroxy-CBD. So I just explained to parents, you're almost like getting 4 over the price of 2. CBD and valproate, the elevation of LFTs, so we know to watch for that. And then the TS community, where the mTOR inhibitors are so widely used now, CBD also significantly inhibits their metabolism, which can lead to a significant elevation of mTOR levels. So when should it be used? I think, again, important message, not a silver bullet. I think a very important addition to our toolbox. Cost and payer coverage, and I know we're going to talk about this in the panel, are key variables, even in the United States, where this is FDA approved and covered by payers. What is approved, estimated $32K per average adult. I think it's less than that now. So in the US, this is not considered first-line treatment now, but it may become so with increasing clinical experience regarding efficacy, safety, and tolerability. As I tell families now, the tolerability side effect profile of this is incredibly favorable to many of the medications I use. I don't know how many people in the audience have heard of a medicine called Felbitol or Felbamate, but I have probably 100 patients on that. And when I have to have that discussion with families, I have to tell them a possible side effect is death. So being able to talk about diarrhea and sedation makes, it's very favorable. And then what about the role of CBD and other disorders? A huge amount of interest. There's a trial now GW is doing, or Jazz is doing in Red. There are trials ongoing in autism, et cetera, but very limited data. When I mentioned TAN before, what I'm wicked excited about is there is a trial now starting with Jazz and Epidiolex, not in epilepsy and TSC, but in TAN. Again, significant morbidity for people living with TS. This will be the first treatment trial specifically addressing that aspect of TS. And then kind of this, I did not have a ton of clinical experience. This is, again, I tell the residents and stuff, when you take a step back, treating your patients, think about not only treating your patient, but what your patients are trying to teach you, and kind of steered my career throughout. But so we started out just small stuff. The EAP was out of control. And so it's grown to what I view as a metropolitan city of people working on this. And then I started with an anecdote. And for those of you there yesterday, sorry to share the same anecdote, but this is very provocative to me. One of the first kids that was in our expanded access program has Booth syndrome, myoclonic astatic epilepsy. She had been on every appropriate medication. She had been on dietary therapy. She had the vagus nerve stimulator, and she was having 40 to 100 seizures per day. Around the time that she started the CBD, her family also had a fundraiser and bought a $17,000 seizure dog. That's what they service animals cost. And they chronicled their journey with CBD by sending me pictures of the dog. And this dog, this is at 1 year, and the dog's retired because Emily had been seizure-free for 1 year at that point. Emily started Epidiolex over 9 years ago. She has been seizure-free since starting the medication. She is now off most of her other medications. The vagus nerve reached end of service. And Emily was able to graduate with a diploma in the United States from high school, which I would have never seen possible had her seizures not become controlled. She's now taking college classes. She is driving, earned money to buy a car, and that would have never happened had her seizures not been controlled. So even though that's an anecdote, and even though CBD does not work for everyone, clearly plenty of patients are benefiting from it. So thank you guys very much for letting me share the story of CBD and Epidiolex in the United States. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. We have time for a couple of questions and then we're heading right to lunch, but I'm sure there are questions. So who wants to go first? Sophia, would you mind if there's a mic, just so that people online can hear the questions in the room? I'll stand out of the way.
Yes, Dr. Russo.
Yes, well, excellent talk. Thanks so much for being here.
It's just because there's people online, so they're the ones who can't hear you.
I can repeat it.
Yeah, we can repeat it. That's true.
So my question relates to the meta-analysis done by Childhood that showed comparable in basically the same population of patients, comparable efficacy with doses of CBD that were about 20% of those used as a pure compound. Obviously, those were just reports, the observational study reports, and not randomized controlled trials. Would you comment on that?
So Ethan, I'm probably not as aware of that data as you are, and I'm going to have trouble repeating it, but there was a meta-analysis done looking at CBD and epilepsy, but lower doses. Is that correct?
Right, but what would be broad spectrum?
Oh, broad spectrum. So it's like Casey. So I think it's difficult to compare. One of the things I find difficult looking at literature like that, and when we looked at this kind of getting ready to start these trials and think about how to design these trials, is don't know exactly what everyone was getting. And kind of, so I think it's hard to compare. I think what it demonstrates to me is we still have a lot to learn. Like we were talking yesterday, is like I had patients who were seizure free on Charlotte's Web at 1/50th the dose we're giving of Epidiolex. You know, and so I even with Epidiolex, I think there's a broad range that I have patients been completely seizure-free at 2 mg per kg per day. So I don't know. And I think I get asked that question a lot. Is there a better efficacy with THC or low beta THC? And I don't know. I mean, I think that's why I'm really excited about the trial being done here. I know that kind of with the trials with Epidiolex proved to me is that purified CBD can be effective for a population of people. You know, and I remember I walked out of one CanMed meeting in Boston several years ago thinking, wow, this plant, you know, has great untapped medical potential and it's going to be different for different people. And even the combination of CBD and clobazam, it's now not one shoe fits all. For each patient, we try that combination. We're titrating up or down on either or both of them to figure out what is the combination that's best for that person. So I'm looking forward to, you know, I think that we actually talked with Jeffrey Guy years ago about should we look at the non-responders or whatever and add in a little bit of THC and see is there a benefit. That never happened. I think I would have had a lot of trouble getting a trial in children with THC approved in the United States. So I think I'm glad it's happening here though and elsewhere.
Hopefully happening under
Hopefully
review. So
happening,
keep those positive. Yeah.
And also in Israel, they use preparations that kind of have higher amounts of THC. And so I think it's tough to really say and compare. And that's where I think I'm glad the international perspective on this. I've gone to a couple of international meetings on cannabinoids where you hear different things from Israel, from Italy, from Germany. And I think that's also something that's very different about this compound and the treatment of epilepsy and other disorders. There's just such a disparate kind of approach to coming towards it and using it. Yes.
Evan and then Michael. Oh, is the mic not? Is it on? Okay.
Hi, Dr. Thiele. I'm Lewis, neurologist here. We've spoken on thank you for that. I'm really interested in the long-term data. I wanted to see the freedom of the population. So, 2 questions. Number one, in the long-term data, any persistent seizure freedom or any children who are being seizure-free and for a period of 3 months? And you have an idea of numbers around that?
Right. Can you just
Yeah,
repeat
so
the question?
the question is long-term efficacy. And do we have kids who have maintained seizure freedom over time? And do we have kids who kind of have efficacy that waned? That summarize that?
Yeah, and specifically seizure freedom, not the 90 or 50% reduction.
So seizure freedom. So I don't have numbers on that, but I know that of my kids they've been on it for 9 years, there are 3 that are completely seizure free and off most everything, off other things. And I have several kids now on CBD as monotherapy and doing well. So I probably have 500 kids on Epidiolex right now. And I have several of them seizure free, some on monotherapy. With regard to maintenance of, and also now from the clinical trials open label extension, there have been several publications and there will also be abstracts at all these upcoming meetings showing maintained efficacy and also very importantly, maintained tolerability. With regard to the short-term efficacy in the world of epilepsy, as you know, with all of our meds, with some of our patients, people experience what is called the honeymoon period, that they'll start a new medication and it works for a period of time and the efficacy wanes. Who knows if it's the efficacy wane? Who knows if it's a change in epilepsy? I think epilepsy is often a new kind of target. But I think, yes, we have seen that with some of our folks, that appears to work for a period of time and then the seizures increase again. It's not different from any of the medications I use.
Great talk. Just one observation. If there's an interesting document of the Indian Pension Commission report, because the Indian government or the British government in 1894 did this commission to look at the medical use of hemp in India, and actually they concluded that moderate uses and moderate dose of medical uses. I'm not it's 2,000 pages long, but if you ever want the PDF on that kind of said it. Now a couple of questions. One is, and this is just an epidemiologic question. The U.S. is interesting because it has states where medical marijuana is approved and states where they're not. And I don't know if this data may not exist, but you know, now since Epidiolex on the market, has there been any difference in medical marijuana use or Epidiolex use in states that do and don't use it?
So that's a really good question. So since initially it was a state by state thing, even with the FDA approval, but then once it was rescheduled to Schedule 5 and then descheduled, Epidiolex now, since it's FDA approved medication, can be used in every state in the United States. That is, you're correct that in some states medical marijuana is not available.
Right. So I guess we don't have any feel for how whether medical marijuana use declines in kids.
No, people have looked at that, and I don't know the most current data on that, because there were some patients who initially wanted to stay on the preparations again, if it, why rock a boat? But I think a main consideration is the fact that it's reimbursed, whereas none of the other preparations are reimbursed. And then the other argument I make with families, and remember, I only do epilepsy, so, and medical marijuana is being used in the United States for many different conditions, just like everywhere else, but in epilepsy, I make the strong point to parents that if they get a dose, every time their kid gets a dose of Epidiolex, I know exactly what they're getting. And I can't say that for any of the other products. For any of the other products, I can't even help them dose it. And Laura and I were talking about this yesterday. I mean, I can't imagine being a parent with one of these epilepsies and feeling like my kid needs to have access to this as a treatment, but my doctor doesn't know how to use it. No, the realm of caring can't tell me how to dose it. So not only am I watching my kid have these awful seizures, but I'm experimenting with their treatment and their dose titration. So I think that, to me, that for many reasons, it makes Epidiolex favorable for my patients.
I mean, at our center, I'm not a neurologist, but I do different autism because none of our development people to it. Actually, I found the hardest work is finding a consistent supplier. I'm not actually lucky at the timeline was consistent, but that I would agree with the problem. This valproic acid, just interesting. Has anyone done any PK on this? Because valproic acid is definitely a lot of the same compounds CBD is. And further to steroid post, I wonder if there's a change in valproic acid concentration.
So no, that's a really, really good question. So we basically looked at that. The valproic acid levels do not change in the blood. We also looked at valproic acid epoxide, which is the other metabolite, the only other metabolite we can clinically measure, no change. As you know, one of the main side effects of valproic acid is hepatotoxicity. So it's thought that somehow there must be some kind of a pharmacodynamic interaction or something that affects metabolism. It's not understood. I actually think it gives us a great opportunity to understand the hepatotoxicity of valproate, because that's never really been understood.
The other possibility I would speculate is there's a lot of reactive metabolites that are evanescent you'll never find. And it's entirely possible we can get an evanescent metabolite treatment tox. That's certainly the case with some of the compounds I've worked with, because some of their half-lives for the metabolites are in seconds. So you can never detect it. By conventional means, we find adults.
Yeah, no, it's of interest, you know, but not sure why, but we know how to keep patients safe by watching for that.
I think Nick is next, then Bruce, and then we're gonna get food, but that's when we can also, Elizabeth will be here for questions. So.
My name is Nathaniel Green, and I'll speak to some of the work I've recently completed at the University of Southern California on the Fulbright Fellowship. So I can partially answer that question. We recently analysed 2021 wave of the International Health Policy Study, and we did look at, particularly in North America, the proportion of patients using for medical purposes, including for epilepsy, who actually had a recommendation for authorization in specifically North America. And we found like the proportion is extremely small. So what's important about this data is the number of patients that are using those medical purposes is extremely high. A lot of those, and I guess the benefit of this particular data set is we can then break it down state by state and look at states with policies conducive to medical use versus those that don't have. And we're currently working on a kind of scale with these different components in a separate study. So that data is forthcoming.
Oh, that's wicked interesting.
Yeah. And Bruce, I think, is the last one, and then we'll grab some lunch, but feel free to keep asking questions. You have just.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent talk. Much appreciated it. My question really is about the opinions and the gestalt of particularly the pediatric and the neurology and epilepsy community. Because in the past, I mean, we all know in this room that there is a huge resistance to the use of cannabis-based medicines. And you're in the enviable position of actually having the only real major evidence to say that these work in these conditions. And you've always got the never use, and I will never ever use it, and then the say I will use it, and then you kind of got that group of people in the middle. My thought was how does the opinion of the community of epilepsy specialists changed with this evidence? And is it moving towards the acceptance, or have you still got this, oh, I'm never going to use it, or whatever else it is, or I don't believe in it because it's cannabis?
That is a brilliant question, and I think about that a lot. That's been one of the most, this journey has been probably one of the most incredible journeys of my career. One of that is the perception of the patient community. Here's a patient population desperately in need of new treatments. First time I heard mentioned, there's a conference in the United States called Epilepsy Pipeline Conference. So kind of what's in the pipeline for the patient community and the medical community. And the man raised his hand at this conference. This was maybe, I can't remember when, 15 years ago. And he said something about, I have a child with Dravet and I've had success with medical marijuana. And it was like fingers on the chalkboard. And I sought that guy out because these kids, it's hard to control their seizures. So anything that might help, I think we owe it to them to consider. I sought him out and talked to him, and his son had had a dramatic response. He showed me videotapes. Water can provoke seizures in kids with Dravet. His son couldn't even go by a water fountain. And then after starting CBD, he could. So pretty dramatic. When this all first started, the American Epilepsy Society meeting was the big meeting. We had just started the EAP. Then president of AES made the comment in front of 3,000 people that she would never use this as a medical therapy for a child of her own. The neuropsychologist who works with me was so angry at her making that comment, thinking that was a completely irresponsible comment to make. Like I said, one of my colleagues thought my career was going to be threatened. Very interesting. So I think that I really do refer to it as the haters. Huge amount of hate in the community. The other thing, not only the hate, because cannabis is so polarized, both in the United States, and Emily has been seizure-free. Her father was very conflicted about her being in that trial because he is a state trooper in Massachusetts. So he felt very conflicted that his daughter was going to be taking an illicit substance. But I think the other thing that has been very different about this journey, and just that there's been less hate. There was a lot of hate about that open label. I was at a meeting in Freiburg, it's a cannabinoid meeting, and a very well-established Italian epileptologist, older, made the comment during a break that when that paper came out in Lancet Neurology, he called the editor and said, "You have lost all credibility publishing this paper." But then I think that when the class 1 data, I think that's when the medical community says, "Oh, how do you defute class 1 data?" So I think that there's still the haters, though. It's only clobazam. It doesn't last. So but I think with the accumulating data and all those publications, I think people are realizing that yes, it works. No, it's not a silver bullet, but yes, it works. The other thing that's been very different is this a treatment option for epilepsy neurology. This is the first time patients have come in asking for things. I don't have patients coming in and saying, "Hey, I heard about this medication, I want to try it." And it's the first time that the patient community knows more about the product than the physicians. None of my colleagues, one of my colleagues for a couple of years while we were doing this kept calling it CDB. And then kind of like getting it, so no one knew. So physicians also don't feel real comfortable a lot of times if families come in with more information than they have. So I think the learning aspect of it, and one of the posters at the meeting yesterday was kind of about the need for increasing education in healthcare providers. Still a big unmet need. But yeah, no, that's been a fascinating part of the journey. And hopefully it has taught the medical community to not be closed-minded about possible treatment options, regardless of source.
That was my poster.
I liked it.
It's up on the table if anybody wants to see it.
I was gonna say, Bruce, you should put it back up on the wall. I'd be happy to support finding tape.
Just real quick comment though, I think it has really impacted that change because now with the development of psychedelics, you're not getting the same hate. You're getting, "Oh, wow, this is really interesting." Whereas I think psychedelics are scarier to me than cannabis.
It's opened the door to more opportunities to explore other things that are unconventional.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.